Hello, everyone. I'm Robin Stewie with Midwest Dairy, and I am glad you could join us today as registered dietitian Bethany Frazier takes us on a deeper dive into the gut microbiome and how diet affects the gut bacterial community, and which in turn can impact your patients' and clients' daily lives. She's also going to give us some practical tips, break down some research for us. So I'm really looking forward to this next hour. Bethany's focuses much of her work on assisting clients with digestive issues and helping them discover how foods can heal you inside and out. You can find more information about her and her work at kansascitydietitian.com. And if you don't already follow her on social media, I encourage you to. She provides up-to-date research and healthy tips in fun and clever ways. I just always enjoy what she does, and it catches my attention every time. As we go through the webinar, just know that Becky will be working on certificates, and those will be coming out in the next few days. And also, if questions come to mind as you listen, please put them in the chat for the question and answer time at the end of the webinar. If you want to put yourself on mute, I know we will probably mute everyone shortly. You can do that. You also don't have to have your camera on, but if you want to, we welcome to see your face as well. So thank you for joining us. Now let's get started. Bethany?
Thank you, Robin. I'm so excited to be here. I love to talk about digestive wellness. Robin said it a little bit gentler than I do. If you follow me on social media, you know there's lots of talk about poop. Something that I think we aren't comfortable enough talking about, but hopefully by the end of this presentation you will be. So really our goal today is just to talk about how we as dietitians can help encourage our clients through the role of gut health. When Rob and I first started this discussion about what we were going to do, what kind of the highlight of this topic would be, and I was thinking about just the different roles that a lot of you play as dietitians, and I just feel like the more and more maybe it's just because I'm in the field of working with digestive wellness, but I do feel like most of us, if it's not you that's struggling with a digestive issue, if it's not a client, it's going to be your sister or your neighbor. There's someone always around us that has some digestive issues. So we should be the people, or we should be at least part of the team that people come to get really good evidence-based knowledge about how to help their gut health. So our two primary objectives today is to provide that solid foundation for understanding this field, and it is emerging every single day. I'm sure if I give this presentation in another year, I will have new information and new applications about the understanding that we have. And then the second part really is just to give that practical application. So that is really what I hope you walk away from. I know many of you are taking time from your lunch break to be able to listen on this. So I want it to be really practical for you, where you can walk away with something to say like, all right, I get this. Now I can help people address their gut dysfunction, assess whether they have gut dysfunction, and even if they don't, give some practical tips to be able to apply nutrition-based treatment and prevention. So let's just start with what is gut flora. So gut flora are going to be all the microorganisms that live in your digestive tract, which is called the microbiome. But they live outside your digestive tract too, or your gut. So they live on your skin, they live in your eyes, they live in your mouth. They live everywhere on your body. It's going to be microbes. There's estimated to be 1 to 100 trillion. That's a big gap there, but that's a lot of bacteria in and on your body. 90% of these are found in your colon, so at large intestines. Bacterial cells actually outnumber human cells 10 to 1. So that means you are technically more bacteria than you are human. And all the bacteria in your body weigh a total of 2 to 6 pounds. So that's a big amount of weight that's coming just from the bacteria, yeast, and viruses that's in your body. Let's talk about some of the functions of the bacteria, because I think we like to think of them as only being just what influences our digestive health. But they also impact our immune function. 80% of our immune function comes from our microbiota. They also prevent the growth of harmful microorganisms. And then that fermentation of indigestible food, like fiber, we'll talk about that a lot more. And then it influences hormones and neurotransmitter production. So serotonin, that feel-good neurotransmitter, 75% of that is created and converted in the gut. So pretty important that we pay attention to our gut, especially in how it influences our moods. Also, the production of nutrients like K2, B vitamins, and then short chain fatty acids like butyrate. So a lot of things that our gut does and why we should pay attention to it. So let's talk about dysbiosis. So dysbiosis is that imbalance of gut bacteria. You can probably kind of assume by the two words put together, dysfunction, like dys, and then that biosis. So when our microbiome is out of balance, it could be for a couple different reasons. Either there's more bad bacteria than there is good bacteria. It could be that there's an overgrowth of pathogens. It could be that there's not enough diversity. So even having a good amount of the right good bacteria, it's just not having enough different varieties under those bacterial communities. And then not having enough of those beneficial microbes. So all of these can lead us down the path of what we call dysbiosis. There's a couple common understood causes of dysbiosis. A couple we can do things about, a couple that we can't. So things like C-section and breastfeeding. We have no control over that. Especially as an adult, you have no control over it. And often even just as a mom making those decisions for your family, you don't have that control. But we do know that influences our gut health, and we've started to figure out ways that we can work around that to prevent some bacterial issues down the road. Low stomach acid is also a really common problem. Stomach acid can be depleted with stress, and stomach acid is what kills off those, that's our first line of defense basically. So it kills off some of those bacteria as they're entering. If you think about, I'm sure none of you have ever done this, but maybe before you were educated on food safety, you ate day-old pizza without it being refrigerated, then woke up the next morning while you were in college and just ate a slice of pizza. Well, your stomach acid is supposed to break that down so that you don't have any harmful pathogens. So not having enough stomach acid can be a problem because that bacteria is allowed to flourish and thrive. Chronic stress can deplete our immune system. It also can influence what our bacterial communities are doing. Frequent antibiotic use. Again, something that many of us don't have any control over, maybe in infancy or even as adults. We don't have control over this often, but that can influence our gut bacteria. Diet, maybe something we have a little bit more influence over. The research right now, things that we can pretty much all agree on, high amounts of processed foods, artificial sweeteners are pretty well researched as having a negative influence on our gut bacteria. And then also infections, things like H. pylori, food poisoning, parasites, and then C. diff. All of those can lead to having a lot more occurrences of dysbiosis or just that imbalance of gut bacteria, whether it's temporary or long-term. Okay, so that dysbiosis also can lead to underlying issues. And this could be things like IBS or other diseases. So IBDs like chronic Crohn's or ulcerative colitis, even autoimmunes. So having a foundation to understand how those develop is really important. Let's talk about what's normal and what's not. I think we all start to normalize what's normal for us, and then we miss out on whether it actually is normal. So key things to ask your friends and your family to help them identify for themselves or clients, whether it's normal or whether it's not. Just because it's normal for them doesn't necessarily mean that it is normal. So as far as IBS is the diagnostic criteria, that's what most of us are going to be under the category from GI issues. You might have some people that do fall in that Crohn's or other GI issues, but about 10% globally are diagnosed with IBS, and that's 35 million people in the US are diagnosed with IBS. IBS is a rule-out diagnosis, so that just means everything else has been ruled out. You don't have fructose malabsorption, you don't have Crohn's, you don't have celiac disease. You have all of these other issues, let's just call it IBS. So it's a functional bowel disease. So being able to identify those and help people understand that having IBS doesn't necessarily mean that there's nothing you can do about it. So some normal things that we would expect to see, having a bowel movement most days. What's not normal is not having a bowel movement most days. We follow the rule of threes. So we want you to have a bowel movement not going longer than 3 days and not going in general more than 3 times a day. And with that, my constipated people, I usually still try and have a goal of going 5 out of 7 days. So it doesn't, if you go 3 days, it's not necessarily ideal, but if you, having that on a reoccurring basis is when it becomes a problem. So having a week that you're on vacation or that you're really stressed and you don't go for 3 days or you go 3 times a day is not a big issue until it becomes a reoccurring issue. You also want to make sure that your stool is formed. The Bristol stool chart is really helpful in identifying what a healthy stool should look like. We want to make sure that it's formed and that it's easy to pass. Having loose stools regularly or having pebble-like stool, neither of those are ideal and can mean that there's some other digestive issues going on. Gas is actually normal. 100% people have gas, in particular when eating those gas-forming foods, so things like broccoli, Brussels sprouts, but we're still gonna produce gas anyways. So regular gas could be normal, but regular gas that's really stinky or painful or accompanied by bloating, that's not normal and should be something that should be looked in a little bit more. Also, occasional heartburn that can be normal, and that's with known trigger foods. Having heartburn for no reason or having it uncontrolled, that's not normal. So things that we want to pay attention to, and hopefully will give you a little bit of a guideline to help you identify in yourself and in your patients whether there's something that needs to be worked on. So now the reason that you're really here, how do we help them? So we're going to talk about some dietary strategies to build that robust gut community. And we're going to go through basically a protocol that I used. So the 5 R's is a systematic protocol that's used by gut practitioners. The 5 R's go through these 5 different R's, actually, and we're going to talk through each of these in a little bit more detail. The first one is remove, and this is where we heal the irritation and get rid of the bad bugs. Also, we're going to be the removal of particular foods that might be the cause of irritation. We're going to replace it while we support proper digestion and replenish those nutrients. And then we want to repair it. So nourishing the gut lining. Reinoculate is going to be reintroducing foods and those bacteria. And then finally, we'll talk about relax, which is using lifestyle to support long-term relief. So we're going to start with remove. Remove, as you can probably assume, is where we are going to be removing foods. And if you're working with a practitioner, another practitioner that's going to be removing with either antibiotics or antimicrobials, this would be in the case of known dysbiosis or imbalance of gut bacteria, or known SIBO, which would be that small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So helping with identifying those and then seeing what we can do. Elimination diets in general, at least in my practice, I use more as symptom treatment in the beginning. So the goal with our elimination diets is that you're going to be able to reintroduce those foods, or at least some of them. Maybe you won't be able to have a total free reign diet, but the goal is that with following these steps, that you should be able to reintroduce most of your foods and know which ones are triggers for you and know the amounts or the types of foods that you can have on a regular basis. Research shows that extreme changes to the diet, so for instance, switching from a low fat or switching from a high fat and high sugar diet to a low fat and high plant-based diet had significant effects on the bacteria within 3 days. So that doesn't necessarily mean your symptoms change within 3 days, but they showed the shift in the bacterial communities within 3 days. I think that's pretty cool. And I think that shows that we do have a big part or big role to play in helping shift some of that bacterial communities. So a couple common GI diets that we see, elimination diets. Low FODMAP has exploded, I would say, in the last 10 years. When I got my start as a dietitian, I worked in the retail as a retail dietitian. And I remember getting a call and they said, I think I have this thing called SIBO. Can you help me take care of this? And I said, sure, like any great new dietitian. I just wrote down all these words, whatever she was saying. I went back to the other dietitian. I said, what do I do? And she said, all right, well, let's look at trying to see what type of elimination diet we should apply. So one of the first things we went down was looking at the low FODMAP diet. So the low FODMAP diet, we won't spend this, again, you probably have, many of you have heard hour-long presentations just on the low FODMAP diet. So we could spend lots of time talking about it, but I'll give you a couple highlights. So the low FODMAP diet, which stands for low fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. So that's our first time as dietitians to get all excited because we get to use those words in normal practice rather than just reading them out of a textbook. So that means basically those fermentable sugars. So trying to remove those from the diet. Again, this isn't a long-term diet because the fermentable fibers are what those gut bacteria need to flourish. We want to make sure the right ones are eating it and not the wrong ones, but we still want to make sure that we're encouraging that diversity in your gut bacteria. The second one that's pretty common is the SCD diet, which is the specific carbohydrate diet. This one limits complex carbs, lactose, and sucrose. One of the interesting things about both the SCD and the low FODMAP is that you can actually have a little bit of dairy, you can have cheeses mostly, and then with the low FODMAP, you can have lactose-free dairy. So all of those are a little bit different than like a paleo or Whole30, because those are going to be dairy free. So a couple different changes that you might see, but most of these diets, the reason why we use them in GI is because they are low in carbs. And those carbs are what the bacteria eat. So they're meant to be, and you'll hopefully understand by the end of this presentation that that is meant to be temporary, because we need those fibers in order to have our bacterial communities be really healthy and thriving. So making sure a couple things that you might see that compare and contrast between that low FODMAP and the SCD diet. Honey is, and this is where it gets really confusing. I see a lot of people who are have long-term GI issues for whatever reason, and they have these diets and they get really confused. They're like, I don't know, I could have this on the SCD diet, but I couldn't have this on the low FODMAP diet. I don't know what to do. So the SCD diet, for instance, you can have honey and you can have fruit tints, which would be garlic and onion. On the low FODMAP diet, you can have sugar, but you can't have garlic and onion, and you can't have honey. So you can't have honey on the low FODMAP, but you can on the SCD. So this is, you can understand why as a person that's trying to follow this, you'd want to pull out your hair. So having a guided professional that can walk them through it is really important, because they need all the support while they're trying to manage your symptoms and identify, are my symptoms getting better? If they're not, for all of these, I usually give the time frame of about 10 to 14 days. Most people can hold on to 10 to 14 days and say, all right, I can try this. I can eat really simply for 10 to 14 days, but much longer than that, if they're not seeing symptom improvement, then this is not the diet for them. The paleo or Whole30 are similar. Paleo is more of a lifestyle, I'll say lifestyle. Whole30 is meant to be a traditional elimination diet. You take it out for 30 days, you reintroduce it and see what your trigger foods are. Paleo is meant to be more long-term. There's some real strict versions of paleo, which could be like the autoimmune paleo style, can be really beneficial for some people. But then there's some looser ones that do allow a little bit of grains or a little bit of beans, just a little bit less unprocessed, which probably would be beneficial for a lot of people with GI issues, at least to pay attention to them. I do like things like the paleo diet because it's an easy thing to recommend to get people to eat a little bit more eat less processed foods, and then they can go to Pinterest and just type in paleo dinner recipes, and that helps them at least have a little bit of guidance. So not a bad idea if you're trying to get someone to just clean up their diet a little bit. Keto pretty much removes all carbs and often adds back in those sugar alcohols or artificial sweeteners, which can be pretty hard on the gut bacteria. So long-term keto can help, or is not really great for our gut bacteria, could help quiet that storm temporarily if needed, just to keep things calm while you're trying to figure out what else is going on. Some common irritants, and this is if you're not wanting to put someone on a widespread elimination diet, these might be things that you would look for on their diet recall. So things like fried foods, dried beans, caffeine, alcohol, carbonated beverages, cabbage, so like Brussels sprouts, sugar alcohols, we already talked about that one, fructose, lactose, gluten, corn, soy, dairy. You're like, okay, well, that's basically everything. So a lot of our foods are going to be common irritants, and that's why, again, that personalized approach where you're looking and saying, well, what do I pick for these people? I always try to pick the least restrictive, because most of these people are coming in pretty sick and they want to feel better. How can I help them feel better the quickest? So I'm gonna give you 2 examples of what I did with 2 of my clients. This first patient just had IBS, or came in with IBS. I suspected SIBO, but they came in with IBS, and this is what they were eating. So Greek yogurt with coffee. For lunch, she was making her own chicken salad with chicken, and then she had like a ranch packet she was using, and then she'd have an apple and nuts. And then for dinner, she was usually having a protein with some pasta or rice blend, and then she would often have a vegetable, and her favorites were Brussels sprouts, asparagus, and broccoli. And then for water, or for drinks, she would drink water. She would drink diet beverages often. And the second patient was eating a pretty low fiber diet. She had IBD and diverticulitis. So she would have cereal with lactose-free milk for breakfast. She would have crackers with peanut butter and then maybe some grapes or another fruit for lunch. And then for snacks, she might have chips, or sometimes she would have nuts or a sweet treat. And then for dinner, she would do like pasta, white pasta with ground meat, or something, rice and pasta, that type of things. So with both of these, I was evaluating, they both came in saying, I think my doctor told me I should go on the low FODMAP diet. What do you think? So the very first one, we went through our diet recall, and you can see that there are several things that would be known high FODMAP foods. So things like the ranch mix would likely have garlic and onion in it. Apple is high FODMAP, and then some of the other ones could be, depending on where she gets it, but obviously like her asparagus, her broccoli, or Brussels sprouts all would be. So we did end up putting her on the low FODMAP diet. She did really, really well, actually, as we removed the foods. The second one, as we looked at her diet, she came in initially saying, I'm going to follow the low FODMAP diet. Can you help me? As we looked at it, I said, you're not eating really any high FODMAP foods. It's not going to do any good to do on that restrictive of a diet. So we actually just tried her on a little bit less processed food and focusing a little bit more on trying to encourage her to eat a little bit more fiber gradually and doing a gluten-free diet initially. And she has seen some really great results as well. So really pairing those diets with what they're coming in initially eating, I think is a really important key from the GI world. So next we're going to talk about replacing. So this is the part where I get really excited. I'm going to try not to like jump out of my chair, but I love to talk about digestion. It's my favorite part of GI. So the phases of digestion, again, this is where we get to nerd out. If you remember back to your days talking about MNT and all of that, the phases of digestion. So the cephalic phase is that first phase, and this happens before and at the start of your meal. So this is the sight and the smell, the taste of food, and this is when that saliva is released, and then about 20% of those gastric secretions, which is pretty important. If you think about nothing's even hit your stomach yet, and it's already starting to prepare yourself for digestion. The important part to understanding the phases of digestion is for you to be able to identify, are there pieces of this digestion that are not functioning optimally that we can work on and support? So that cephalic phase, if you think about the one that I always use in the example, if you've bit into something really sour, my first thought is always the Sour Patch Kid, and you felt almost like that pain from your saliva being released because it's so sour, that's going to be that cephalic phase and a really overexpression of it, where it's breaking, or it's sending all the saliva that has enzymes in it to start to digest that food. The second phase is the gastric phase, which this is going to be your stomach. Your stomach will release HCl, which is that hydrochloric acid, to start to break down that food. The end product of what's going on in your stomach is to bring it to a certain pH so that it can release it into your intestines. So that's where sometimes it gets a little bit dicey if someone's on a PPI or a proton pump inhibitor, something like an omeprazole, then the stomach acid is really tightly regulated. So sometimes that can cause delayed gastric emptying or other problems that can make it harder for food to digest. So then the intestinal phase is the third phase, and this is where your pancreatic enzymes, your bile, and then the remaining 5 to 10% of your gastric secretions are happening. So all three of these phases are really important in digestion, and we have to make sure each step is functioning optimally. So this is where the replace phase comes in. It's important to note that anytime someone is experiencing these issues and they come to me, or if they come to you, that they've already been evaluated by a doctor, and most of what I deal with are going to be those functional diseases where they have been evaluated, they know there's nothing actually wrong with them, and they just are still having these issues. So undigested food and stool, not normal. If you are having like corn is one of the few that we still see. Sometimes if you eat a lot of vegetables, and you see occasionally like red pepper skins is maybe a normal one. If you eat a ton of quinoa or something like that, then you might see some fiber, but it's still not super normal to always see food in your stool. Even leafy greens, that's something I hear a lot with my IBD patients, that they will see leafy greens again. And those are things we want to still work on supporting that digestion, because that's not normal. Greasy or oily sheen to your stool, bloating right after a meal. When our stomach empties out the contents of it, it's usually 30 minutes to 60 minutes after a meal. So if you're having symptoms within 30 minutes to 60 minutes after a meal, and you have no reason to think that you have delayed gastric emptying, that usually is related to either not having enough digestion from either your mouth or your stomach, or that there's something else going on that's causing things to slow down. We talked about that. PPI use can cause a little bit of a mix-up in the signaling of when it's time to send that stuff out of your stomach. Of course, diarrhea, constipation, the catch-all, that your digestion is impaired. Okay, so this, oops, sorry, go back to one. Okay, so this one tells us just a couple things that you might initially think if you see undigested food in your stool. Could be enzyme activity, greasy or oily sheen in stool, could be fat digestion, so that could be enzyme breakdown, it could be bile, it could be pancreas, it could be anything that's not properly digesting. Bloating right after meals, we talked about that one, but that stomach acid is usually the first thing I think about, and then diarrhea or constipation. Enzyme activity is usually probably gonna be my first go-to, but it could also be stomach acid or enzyme activity. Okay, so how do we fix it? There's a couple things that I think are really important. One of the things to think about is how we're stimulating that digestion. So making sure we're sending appropriate signals. Replacing with food, those bitter foods like we talked about Sour Patch Kids. So those bitter foods help with the upper GI symptoms because they're stimulating your body to do what it's supposed to do naturally. Before you even get to that phase, if you can help your people, even one thing that you take away is to chew your food. We really want to encourage chewing your food 20 to 30 times. Start counting your food. How many times do you chew? And most people chew 2 to 3 times, even for hard to chew things like meats. And that's not allowing your body even to send the signals that, hey, we're getting ready for this load of chicken to come down. I'm ready to digest it. So chewing your food really well. I had a client who came in with 15 plus years of reflux. And she came in twice and she said the second time, she said, I feel really stupid. She said, I told my husband, I had to pay this girl all this money just to tell me I need to chew my food better. Like, that's what happens. We get busy and we don't chew our food enough. She had a couple other things we worked on, but that is a huge thing that can make a load of difference just to chew our food well. So if we have an issue with, maybe I've worked with people who have Sjogren's, an autoimmune that causes them not to have enough of that saliva production, or people who have had radiation and they don't, upper radiation, and they don't have enough saliva production or signaling. People who have strokes who they don't release enough of those enzymes for one reason or another. So things to consider are bitter foods before a meal that can help to signal to your body, hey, it's time to digest. If they have reflux and they're not going to tolerate something like a citrus, you could even do like the peel of an orange or peel of a lime just to get a little bit, or even just like a little bit of lemon or lime juice in water can help. Arugula or fennel, so any of those bitter foods, radishes, apple cider vinegar is really easy. It's disgusting, but it's really easy. Just a half a teaspoon in water before a meal. And you can even hold it in your mouth. Any of these foods, you can hold it in your mouth for just a second, and that can help just to send those signals to your brain, say, hey, we're ready for digestion. What should we do next? So cranberries, ginger tea is also an easy one. So all these are things that you can do right before a meal to help to stimulate your body to say, let's release these enzymes, let's release the saliva and see if we can help you move on to digesting. Now, when enzymes are an issue, if you're not releasing enough enzymes, then sometimes we can support that with foods. So foods like pineapple releases bromelain, which helps with the digestion of proteins. And all these release different enzymes, and that's not really the most important part. It's just being able to have a wide variety of foods. Again, another push for us to encourage a wide variety of foods because it's going to help with that digestion. So having pineapple as a side or having papaya or mango as a side can help to have enough of those enzymes to break down the protein, break down the carbs, and really support the digestion. And you can decide whether they can help decide, I would eat these things, I wouldn't eat these things. So you could still provide them with a list like this that says, these are some things that might help with your enzyme activity. Which one of these potentially would you eat at most meals? There was a randomized control trial that was done on women that they gave bananas to, and they showed an improvement in bloating with pre-meal consumption 2 times per day. So 1 banana at lunch, 1 banana at dinner. With the enzyme activity that was released, they did, in the study, they looked at their bacterial communities. It didn't actually change their bacterial communities, or not statistically, but it did help with their symptom of bloating. So their assumption was that it had to do with the enzymes that were released from the bananas. So again, foods can help when they're paired together. It's not just about our carb consumption, but foods together can help us digest other foods. And that's why just the carnivore diet is a little bit hard to eat, because we don't have any of those enzymes from other foods to help us break it down. We're going to talk about kefir a little bit more in just a second, but that's another big one that can help with breaking down foods. Okay, so prebiotics is next. Prebiotics are basically foods that help to feed the good gut bacteria. And there's a couple criteria that we have to do in order to be designated as a prebiotic food. It has to be resistant to stomach acid. It can't be broken down by enzymes. It can't be absorbed in the GI tract. And the goal is to get it to the bacteria that's primarily in your colon. Remember, we talked about 90% of it's in your colon. The goal is to make sure that it arrives intact so that it can feed the good gut bacteria. So there's a lot of different sources that you might see in different foods added in, or it might be naturally occurring. And they, you'll see if you, again, are familiar with the FODMAP diet, that a lot of these are going to be in that FODMAP category, high FODMAP category, because those are fermentable fibers. And so things that we want that bacteria to ferment. That's why I pulled out this list of low FODMAP options as well. Things like bananas and berries and chickpeas, flaxseed, kefir, kiwi, all of these are going to be good options for someone that needs to follow a low FODMAP diet. But there's some other good ones that, like chicory or inulin, might be things that you would see in like a granola bar or a cereal. And that's where those prebiotic fibers are coming from. Prebiotics are also the third largest component of cow's milk. So lipids, lactose, and then those oligosaccharides. But they're actually less, and probably you've seen, if you looked at any baby formulas, you've seen that they have the new advertising pieces that they've had HMOs added. HMOs are those human milk oligosaccharides. So those are those prebiotics to help feed the infant's microbiome. So what we're seeing from cows, for a number of reasons, is that they don't provide quite as much. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in a little down the road. But this is where we might be using a bovine form of colostrum to help with some of those prebiotics. We might see this in other products down the road, but it's probably not likely that you're going to get a lot of those prebiotics from cow's milk, but still going to get some of those gut bacteria that help to stimulate the mucus lining and then ultimately feed the bacteria to help produce things like short chain fatty acids. Okay. Resistant starch is similar to a prebiotic, but it acts like a prebiotic. It's not a true form prebiotic. So these are starches that are resistant to digestion, so they pass through the gut as well. So the way to make a resistant starch in general is most starchy foods will make it if they've been cooked, cooled, and not reheated. So this could be things like potato salad. You usually cook a potato salad and then you don't reheat it. Could also be things like green bananas or overnight oats. Really popular right now is overnight oats. So a good way to get some resistant starch in is to have overnight oats. It still retains that because it hasn't been recooked. Even though you don't always cook your overnight oats, you still get resistant starch from that. This also is going to, like the prebiotics, going to help create some of that fuel for that gut bacteria. I find as another workaround for people to feel a little bit less weirded out by this, if they meal prep a bunch of rice or potatoes ahead of time, don't reheat that, but we'll reheat things like the chicken or anything, the protein that they're going to put on it. That way they can kind of make it a little bit better temperature. Sometimes that helps people encourage adherence to that recommendation to get a little more resistant starch. Okay, so next we're going to talk about repair. Before we get to that, we have to talk about what are we repairing. So if there's inflammation, this picture, and I'm going to say a word, and I hope I'm not going to see a bunch of people jump out, but this picture is actually taken from Krause's Food and Nutrition Care Manual. So the book that probably most of us have on our shelves somewhere. So we all talked about leaky gut in our undergrad. So leaky gut, which is so popular, and if you're like me, I'm like, I just can't say the word because it's too trendy. But you can see from this picture that there's a lot going on when we're talking about leaky gut, and it actually is based in science. So a healthy gut barrier will help you convert those nutrients and help you make sure that you're getting it into where it needs to go. But when you have quote unquote a leaky gut, which could be caused by infections you see from medications, from stress, you see what that looks like. That causes inflammation. And then through that inflammation, you can get things like negative food reactions. This is probably my favorite because everyone says, well, first I get people all the time, do I have leaky gut? I'm like, well, maybe, I don't know. But the negative food reaction is like we talked about that elimination diet. with some healing, we might be able to reintroduce some of those foods that people said, I could never have this. I'm so sensitive to gluten. Well, if you're not a celiac, you might be able to reintroduce gluten, or you might be able to reintroduce, I don't know, cucumbers or something random that you feel like you're very sensitive to, with some intentional healing. This also can compromise our immune system if that's an issue with our gut permeability. So that's where things like allergies and asthma and eczema can all be developed or linked to our gut. Nutrient malabsorption can also be when there's inflammation present. Of course, our cells don't want to absorb as many nutrients as possible, and increased risk for autoimmune disease. This is where I think a lot of those big people, I don't know, social media and all that will talk about the risk for autoimmune. And that is true, that there's a risk for more of that just as we have more inflammation. So what do we do? How do we heal it? And how do we, probably not as much identify it, but how do we heal it and prevent it? So one of the first things is to identify fiber. So fiber with people in the GI world is often the F word because it's not very well receptive. They're like, oh yeah, my doctor told me to take some sort of fiber and it didn't help. Either it didn't cure my diarrhea or it didn't help my constipation. So that's where we get to come in as the nutrition experts to try and help them. Fiber helps to develop that healthy mucus lining. So like we just talked about, that gut permeability, we want to develop that mucus lining that helps protect our gut lining, and then also regular transit time, either not too quickly and not too slowly. We want both sides of that spectrum to be functioning optimally so that we can absorb those nutrients and not, stool doesn't just sit there or rush right through and we're not absorbing everything. You know a lot of this, most of you know a lot of this, 25 to 35 grams per day. It's estimated that most people get less than 50% of their recommended fiber. Gut bacteria need this fiber to ferment. That's why those high fat diets can be a little bit problematic for our digestive system. So making sure you're focusing on even on good protein forms that include fiber, like beans, can help to encourage that. And focusing on the bigger picture of more plant-based foods. So I think a lot of us get stuck in eat more fruits and vegetables, and sometimes people with GI issues really can't tolerate more fruits and vegetables. So I'm always encouraging more plant-based foods to start with. The things that I find really good adherence to when people are really sick and they just don't feel like they can tolerate a lot of my recommendations. We start slow, but I have flax or chia seed is for people that really don't want to change their diet or can't change their diet for one way or the other. I recommend getting one of those bigger pill dividers. Those hold about 2 tablespoons and they can sprinkle it throughout the day. So they're having a smoothie for breakfast, sprinkle a little bit in their smoothie. And then at lunch, they're having a sandwich with mayonnaise as their spread, sprinkle a little bit into their mayonnaise. And then at dinner, they're having mashed potatoes and sprinkle a little bit in your mashed potatoes. So you're getting some of those plant-based fibers to things that maybe aren't inherently super healthy, but they're getting some of that in addition to what they're already eating. The other one, which I showed a picture on here, is sun fiber. Sun fiber is a prebiotic fiber, so it's a product that I use quite a bit just for people in those starting phases. It is activated guar gum. So it is a plant-based fiber, of course, and it's tasteless, non-gritty, so it's really easy from an adherence standpoint. And you can buy it on Amazon, so really easy to get too. It's good for both diarrhea and constipation, heavily researched. And it is also really great for SIBO if someone is getting antibiotic treatment for SIBO, to make sure it increases the likelihood that you're going to get rid of it with antibiotics by about 10%. So I like to use that one. It's very gentle. So people that, again, are afraid of the F word, the fiber word, when I introduce this one, they usually don't have problems. I've had very few people that have had any problems introducing this. So another good resource. Okay, a couple other considerations to think of when we're trying to repair with foods. So omega-3, really soothing. We know this from a lot of different areas, cardiovascular health, eye health, basically everything that we talk about as in nutrition. 1 to 3 grams per day is what we're looking at, whether you're doing a supplement, which is usually about 1,000 milligrams, or if you're talking about providing this either with fish or with other foods like walnuts or chia seeds, flax seeds, those types of things, to make sure they're getting enough omega-3. Aloe vera is another one that you could consider. It's very calming, just like we would use it on our skin. You can use it internally. Make sure it's the gel only, and that I usually will use like in a juice. That's pretty easy for people to add in a little bit of juice every day. That's the aloe vera juice. You can mix it in with a little bit of tonic water, and then it's a little bit more like a beverage. unless like a thick aloe vera juice if they don't like the taste. Turmeric is also really nourishing. The bioactive component in turmeric is curcumin, and it helps with barrier function. They did a research study on athletes. So athletes, lots of research has shown that athletes, performance athletes, Olympic athletes, probably some recreational as well, but they have leaky gut after that quote unquote leaky gut or that intestinal permeability after exercise. So in this one study, they induced that to a heightened level by making these people work out in a really hot environment. And then they did for 3 days, they did 500 milligrams per day of curcumin. And they showed the difference that it was the people that didn't have it had 80%, 87% level of increase of those bad LPSs or those bad signals for increasing that intestinal permeability issues, versus the other group had a lot less. It was in the 50s. So you're still going to have that quote unquote leaky gut, but you were able to improve it by 30-something%. And the people that use the curcumin treatment also were able to produce or protect against another bacteria that often will cause that barrier defects, Campylobacter jejuni, and that one they were able to decrease the damage that was caused from that. So we know that temporary or acute leaky gut happens for athletes, and they were able to help this just by using turmeric. So the recommendation is 1.5 teaspoons per day, or if you're going to use like a curcumin supplement, it's 500 to 2,000 milligrams per day. Really safe for people to use, especially using in place of things like NSAIDs that might cause gastritis or other issues. You can try turmeric for people that have chronic ailments, whether that's just injuries or headaches, things like that. It often is a really great solution. Vitamin A rich foods, vitamin A and vitamin D are both really important to that intestinal lining. So you can see from this picture that when there was sufficient amounts of vitamin A and vitamin D, these two bacteria were flourishing. And these are commensal bacteria that we want to be in a healthy balance. When we're deficient in vitamin A and vitamin D, that this proteobacteria, which is one that's really linked to dysbiosis, so that imbalance of gut bacteria and inflammation, that when that is present, or when not enough vitamin A and vitamin D are there to mitigate all the processes, and again, we could probably spend an hour on just this process alone, that it becomes a problem to that lining of the intestine. So again, a really important piece to make sure people are eating enough vitamin A rich foods and vitamin D rich foods, getting their sunshine, doing all of that as necessary. Colostrum is another big piece. We talked about this a little bit before in the prebiotic piece, but colostrum is often taken in a supplement form because we can't really get it in many other forms. And that one is usually in bovine immunoglobulins, and that is about 2 grams per day is shown to help with protecting that barrier. Okay, next up, we're going to talk about reinoculating. And this is where we're talking about reintroducing foods and then also the fermentation of foods. So really fun fact that Genghis Khan, who was the founder of the Mongol Empire, is said to have fed his army yogurt. And his reasoning was that he thought it instilled bravery in his warriors. Well, we know now that it actually was helping to support their overall health. So it's pretty cool to think about that long ago, they were feeding their army as the special food. Now we're able to eat it on a daily basis if we want to. So just because a food is fermented or created by a fermentation process does not necessarily mean that it has microorganisms in it. So some common examples, bread, like sourdough bread, beer, or wine. That doesn't mean that it's bad or that it doesn't have any beneficial pieces. Just because there's no microbes present after when you're consuming it doesn't mean that it's still not providing a functional role. So things like wine, when the fermentation process releases those polyphenols from the grape skins, and then from sourdough bread, phytase is released that helps with the mineral extraction. So still beneficial, just not necessarily a fermented food that's providing those microbes. Fermented foods as a recommendation helps with the diversity of our gut bacteria. It might not be appropriate for people who have yeast problems or IBD. Sometimes I use caution with those, or even active SIBO. I'll use caution with recommending too many fermented foods because I think that it makes their symptoms worse often. And you might have someone come in who says, oh, I tried that kombucha and it made me really sick. And that might be why. if they have some other underlying, is it's shifting the gut bacteria, and that can cause acute symptoms. And so being more gentle in your approach or trying a different form might be more appropriate. Cultured dairy has some of the highest forms of fermented foods. You can see from this list, so kombucha, yogurt, cultured buttermilk, which I think is something that a lot of us forget about when most of us aren't going to drink buttermilk, but you can use it as a food and other ingredients. Anytime a food has been heated, so if you're going to buy sauerkraut or like a shelf-stable pickles, those are not going to provide actual microbes. So if you're going to buy sauerkraut, it needs to be refrigerated and it needs to be produced without vinegar. And you probably think, well, do they make sauerkraut? If you've never made sauerkraut yourself, you probably are thinking, do they make sauerkraut without vinegar? Because it has that really vinegary taste. But most of them are just created by that salt water. So things like olives often are not, do not have active cultures, but they're still, of course, we know, nutritional. So good things to still have in your diet, just not necessarily going to provide all of that bacteria that we're looking for. So you'll see on this picture, I put this Chobani label, this live and active seal. If you see this on a product, it indicates that there's 100 million cultures per gram. So that's a designation that's voluntary, but sometimes beneficial to look for or direct your patients towards if they're looking. Most often you're going to see it on a dairy product. So just to kind of take a couple steps back, let's think about our gut. We talked about it being 1 trillion to 100 trillion amounts of microbes. And then the foods we were just talking about were in the billions, and often our probiotics are in the billions of CFUs. So there's few RCTs or randomized controlled trial studies that have considered the benefits of fermented foods alone. So there's lots of research that's shown that relationship, like, oh, people who eat more yogurt often have better control of their blood sugars or things like that, but few of them have that direct correlation or causation. But there is lots of evidence that seems to support the health benefits of it. One of the strongest is that yogurt consumption improves lactose intolerance. I talked about this a little bit with the kefir, but we know that probiotics usually provide a temporary members of the microbiome, so we want to make sure we're regularly incorporating them to help to make sure that we are getting those benefits. So kefir is one of those that has been researched to improve lactose intolerance. There's a couple studies that are probably the best known, but this one, I think it's a little, I probably would have problems encouraging my people to drink this much, but 32 ounces daily, that was in 2 different doses, improved constipation. I usually don't go that high, but I'll usually do 4 to 8 ounces, and it can help with constipation just anecdotally, but the research supports it in higher levels. And then improves IBD, and this is both pain and bloating. That's 26 ounces, so a little bit less, but still a good recommendations. I know that there's tons of probiotics on the market, and so I like to give this recommendation. There's this clinical guide for probiotics. It's an app on your phone. I think they have a website as well, but I just use the app on my phone. It looks just like this. And here's a couple of the highlights, which ones to look for. If you can put in what you're looking for. So if you're looking for which ones help with constipation, you can see what the studies are and the strength of the studies for each specific strand. So you can look at the strands that are provided in your probiotic. It also will have some specific brands. So like this one says Align, or it says Culturelle. So different ones that are highly recommended for that issue. The last thing that I want to make sure we talk about is the relax. So stress plays a big role in our gut. I always talk about our stress bucket. So a number of things can cause stress. It's not always that felt stress. But stress can inhibit those cleansing waves, that migrating motor complex. If your body is not allowed to go through all the cycles, it can become problematic for your digestion. It also increases that intestinal permeability. We've seen that earlier. And then it affects your body's ability to heal. So if you're trying to heal those intestine mucus lining, it can be a problem. So for people that don't want to, are too sick to change their diet or change some of their other pieces, I always think that lifestyle is a good place to start. Movement is a good place or an easy thing to add on. Focus on a well-rounded routine. We talked about how athletes at high levels can cause that leaky gut. Even just temporary, it's just temporary, but it still causes that. So that same idea for non-athletes or people that are routinely exercising, if they're doing only high levels of CrossFit or HIIT workouts, that in addition to all the other stresses in their life can sometimes be too much. So paying attention to what their movement activities are, and if they need to incorporate more rest days, some strength, flexibility, that all helps with gut health and encouraging that stress response. People who are bare minimum will not do anything. The yoga is really beneficial, and I really like the cat-cow pose. That's why I put this picture. It's really good for intestinal health, in particular constipation. So I'll have people do a couple of rounds of this before bed. Definitely doesn't hurt, and helps from a just an intestinal, abdominal strengthening. Breathing exercises are really important. We talked about chewing. The two things I recommend before every meal: breathing exercises and chewing. So breathing exercises you can do helps prevent you out of that fight or flight response. Helps to signal to your brain from I'm running a marathon all day long to I'm sitting down and resting and digesting my food. So I'll recommend doing either simple breathe in for 10, breathe out for 10. You can do this while your kids are screaming around you. You can do this while everything else is, you're trying to take a step away from your computer and starting to eat lunch. You can do 4, 7, 8 or 4, 8, 7. Breathe in for 4, hold for 8, breathe out for 7. This takes a lot of abdominal strength, so it's hard. The first time you try it, it's really hard. So continuing to practice that is really great. Relaxes your mind, but also has some control of your vagus nerve and other pieces that are really important. Sleep is also really important, and something we need to make sure that we talk about. Our gut microbiome also has a circadian rhythm. So we want to encourage it by following on a regular sleep schedule. So not just getting 7 to 9 hours, but making sure that we go to sleep around the same time and wake up around the same time. Lastly, environment. Making sure that you pay attention to your environment. Getting outside is really important. We talked about vitamin D. So it's trying to get outside daily, making sure that you have a wide variety of foods, which is that lack of beneficial bacteria and those enzymes. And then the use of antibacterial stuff. I know really controversial right now in the COVID time. So just doing what you can as far as limiting the best that you can. So I know we flew through those last couple of things because I wanted to make sure we had a couple of minutes for questions. So hopefully I didn't skip over anything too important, but you have these slides, or Becky will make sure that you have these slides to go back to and use as a reference. I hope that you will use it as a reference, that we talked about things that were interesting to you and that they were beneficial, but I wanted to see if there's questions, things that we talked about that you wanted some more clarity on, or things we didn't talk about that you wanted to make sure what the current consensus is on. I'm happy to answer those.
Bethany, great. I love it. I could be taking notes and making some earmarks here on things. So there was one question that came in on the chat, and it was, my understanding of resistant starch was that you could reheat cooked and cooled starches and still get resistant starch. Is that correct?
Nope, it's just cooked and cooled. So reheating damages the starch. There might be still some present, but it is the most amount is going to be if you don't reheat it. And that resistant starch is good for those gut bacteria. 90% in your colon. You want to make sure it's producing lots of those bacteria, or producing the bacteria to help it flourish. We want to feed it.
Thank you, Bethany. This has been really interesting. I've enjoyed hearing your talk. I'm thinking about the enzymes that you talked about, the list of food enzyme producers, and I wondered if there is any information available on how much of those food-based enzymes are helpful past stomach acid, or if those are not active in the stomach before the stomach acid.
Yeah, and so that's why some of the benefit comes from a food when it's paired with something else. So you're still able to get some of it past stomach acid, but you really just need your enzymes, well, most of the enzyme activity you need to happen in your stomach. So you're not going to get as much from a food as you would. So if you know that you have an enzyme deficiency where you're like, okay, my pancreas isn't shooting out as much as it needs, you're not necessarily going to get as much as you need from a food. But having foods that have enzymes in them help to digest the foods that you're already consuming. So I think that answered your question, at least a little bit. Is it surviving past stomach acid? Some of it, and the amounts in the research that I looked at, the amounts of enzyme activity in the foods is so varied just based off of the type of seed that was used and where it was grown and all of that. So it is just kind of guesses, because just like we all know, any food that is nature, we can't really control. So the understanding is that yes, you definitely get benefit from it. It's just how much benefit is not going to overcome something that's really problematic, but it should still help.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Other questions? You can just unmute yourself and ask.
Hi there, this is Anne. Thank you,
Hey.
Bethany. What is there a certain amount of the aloe vera gel?
I didn't put it in my presentation. I have it. I didn't put it in there. I can send it out. I don't remember what the exact number is, but I do have it. So there is an exact amount. I just don't remember what it is.
Okay.
So on the spot. I don't know all the numbers. Just some.
Amazing presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne.
Well, it is 1 o'clock, and I know everybody's time. But if there is a last question or two, oh wait, there is one in the box, in the chat box. I have seen research stating kombucha and other fermented foods are bad for allergies. True? Question mark.
I guess it depends on which type of allergies. If you're talking like seasonal allergies, or if you're talking about like a food allergy. So there's a couple different things that we kind of talked about. So like kombucha is going to probably have yeast in it, which can be, we talked about that being a little bit problematic. It also can be hard for people that have histamine issues. That would be like the seasonal allergies. So people that we know have histamine issues, whether that's a seasonal allergy or even histamine, sometimes histamine is the issue from a dietary. We didn't even talk about that because that again would be a whole nother presentation. But that could be the reason why you would have seen that in recommendations or research is to not do fermented foods, would be from the histamine standpoint for allergies. And so I do use lots of caution with people, even probiotics in general, for people that, because our gut bacteria produce histamine. And so if we have known people that don't tolerate histamine for whatever reason, aren't good at recycling it, then sometimes I will use caution with that. So yes, there's true and false to that, I guess. It depends on the person, I should say.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Bethany, for this presentation today. I think we've all can walk away with some great additional new information, maybe a reminder of some information we have learned, but maybe haven't worked in that area as much. I do want to remind everybody that a certificate, Becky Partial will be sending out the certificate, and we are making the slides available. Thank you, Bethany, for helping us with that. And those should come by email in the next few days. So thank you for joining us. Have a great week. I guess this is the beginning of the week, so have a great rest of the week. And thanks again, Bethany.
Thank you.